Yo, have you heard of LinkedIn Learning? If you haven't, LinkedIn Learning is an American massive open online course provider. It provides video courses taught by industry experts in a variety of subjects. Now, why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this because Living Corporate is in partnership with LinkedIn Learning to provide diversity, equity, and inclusion courses. Listen, if you're trying to be a better ally, you want to understand better diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, or you just want to learn how to be a better leader, you got to check out the courses on LinkedIn Learning. So check it out. You can do it one of two ways. You can click the link in the show notes, or you go to LinkedIn Learning and you search Living Corporate. Again, link in the show notes, or go to LinkedIn Learning and search Living Corporate. I'll see you over there. Hey, yo, y'all got to wake up. Wake up. I get your attention. Did I get it? Today's interview is with Michelle Kim, author of The Wake Up, talking about this work, talking about equitable workplaces and like how folks need to really wake up, wake the hell up, I'll even say. Now, her book isn't Wake the Hell Up. I'm adding that for emphasis, okay? But no, really great conversation we had with her. I want y'all to check it out. Make sure you click the link in the show notes. Learn more about Michelle Kim, the incredible work she's doing. You know, I appreciate Michelle. I was just actually talking to someone about memorable interviews that I've had. And of course, all of our interviews are incredible. What I appreciate about Michelle and a few other people, like in the years of doing Living Corporate, is sometimes you have these interviews where you just feel warm. You know, you feel like the conversation, it's therapy for you. You feel a certain level of gentleness, like you're being taken care of, like while you're having the conversation, which is like a unique thing. I imagine that other interviewers can relate to what I'm saying. Sometimes like this work can be really draining and laborious, just emotionally and mentally and spiritually. And so it's great when you can talk to people and in the conversation feel refreshed. I recall specifically after this interview, I walked away feeling much more refreshed. And so I want to thank Michelle just for her spirit, for her attitude, and just for her work and all of the contribution that she makes both on stage and behind the scenes. So before we listen to Michelle, you know what we got to do, unless you're a first-time listener. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. We get first-time listeners every week. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to y'all. For the first-time listeners, this is where we tap in with Tristan. Tristan Layfield is a career coach and resume consultant. He does incredible work. Make sure, if you haven't already clicked in and tapped in with Tristan, learned about his content, learned about his services, that you do that. Tristan is a subject matter expert when it comes to career management and resume writing. Okay. So with that being said, we're going to tap into his segment and then we're going to get to our conversation with Michelle. See you soon.
What's going on, Living Corporate? It's Tristan, and I want to thank you for tapping back in with me as I provide some tips and advice for professionals. This week, I want to have an honest conversation on expanding your view of what options are available to you. I've been having conversations with job seekers who tell me that their job is wearing them out and they're looking for something different. They wanted to change their job so badly that they hop on job boards and start looking for new positions. When I ask them to provide me with some job descriptions that have piqued their interest, they send me postings for the exact role they told me they wanted to leave. Have you ever been in that position? Don't worry, it's a common mistake, and most of us aren't even aware that we're doing it. There are typically 3 reasons why job seekers fall down this pigeonhole. First, they are comfortable in those type of roles. Second, they think they've reached a pinnacle and believe those roles are the best they can do. And third, they aren't sure what other options are out there that may align with their skill sets. To me, all of those lead to one thing. They have a very narrow view of what they want to do and where it is possible to do it. If you find yourself scrolling through pages and pages of the same position that you said you wanted to get away from, work to expand your view. Become aware of what other career opportunities may be out there. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with the same mess in a similar role, just at a different company. If you aren't sure where to start, seek out some help. You may want to start with a mentor or sponsor, but ultimately, I'd suggest trying to work with a career coach to help you think outside of the box and identify roles you didn't know existed but are perfect for the experience you have. Thanks for tapping in with me today. Don't forget, I'm now taking submissions from you all on career questions, issues, concerns, or advice you think may be helpful for others. So make sure to submit yours at bit.ly/tapintristan. That's bit.ly/tapintristan. This tip was brought to you by Tristan of Layfield Resume Consulting. Check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Layfield Resume, or connect with me, Tristan Layfield, on LinkedIn.
Michelle, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
Listen, you've been all around, right? Like you got your book launch. You've been talking DEI for a while. You're the CEO, founder of Awaken.co. How are you?
Oh, that's a heavy question these days.
We rescheduled.
Yeah, we rescheduled a few times, with the war, with the Atlanta shootings, the anniversary, and the anti-Asian violence that's been on the rise again. And I've also had some personal health issues, so I appreciate the flexibility. I've been holding a lot of complexity in this moment and also trying to make room for joy and healing through having conversations like this. So I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Well, it's interesting. I think as I continue to just kind of engage in this space, Michelle, I think I'm just starting to kind of see the nonsense. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm starting to peep the jig, as young people say.
Is that what young people say?
I guess. I don't know. They'll say like the jig, and then they'll post pictures of like people pointing up because like the jig is up.
Mm.
I'm curious to get your perspective on diversity, equity, inclusion work, like in the typical corporate context. Like, one, like what do you think is going on?
Yeah.
And then two, like what is Awakened? What are you doing that is different than that?
Yeah. Well, the whole reason why I co-founded Awaken was because of what I saw happening in the corporate space around DEI that felt so whitewashed, white-led, white-centered, and diluted from the work of social justice. I started my work really in grassroots organizing when I was a youth activist, when I was in the queer and trans people of color activism space. That's really the start of my DEI journey, if you will. And then when I found my way into corporate America and saw how DEI was being talked about and executed on, it really caused a lot of cognitive dissonance for me in terms of comparing the real sort of systemic oppression that we're addressing and working on in the grassroots organizing world versus what folks were talking about and packaging as, equity work. But really that was diluted and so disconnected from the roots of social justice that felt really harmful and violent. So, starting Awaken for me was my way of bridging that gap and ensuring that when we're talking about DEI, let's talk about it as if it's an extension of social justice work and that we don't forget the core messages or dilute it or whitewash it, but make it still accessible enough that people can still interact with it, grapple with it in the corporate setting. The book is sort of the culmination of some of the lessons learned, and the stories that I've shared in it are my lived experiences, both as a queer woman of color, but also as somebody who's navigated so many different spaces, including the grassroots world, but also corporate America, consulting, and having spent, numerous years in the tech landscape doing this work.
It's interesting because you talk a bit about social justice. You used the word social justice several times. Like, how do you combat or respond to like just how white narratives are now leveraging that language in a as a pejorative, right? So like, what does that mean when you say social justice and DEI work?
I feel immense frustration seeing how words that come from the social justice world get co-opted and get exploited and used in such a way that it gets so diluted and far from the original intent of the word. Like things like allyship, I feel has become so diluted to a point where now people are kind of making fun of the word in some spaces. And so for me, I feel like when I talk about social justice, it's defined to me by a set of principles. Um, like I talk about in the book, the importance of the principle of centering the most marginalized communities at all times when we're thinking about creating processes, policies, or doing any type of movement work in or outside of the workplace. That when we are working from a place of centering the most marginalized people and their voices, their needs, and their humanity and healing, that should be the core of how we do this work. And that is a principle of social justice, in my opinion. Versus when we just look at this work as an extracurricular activity, like most companies do, in terms of when they see and think about DEI work, and they look at this from a sort of very theoretical, academic, intellectualized best practices lens. I feel like some of those principles get really lost and misconstrued to a point where DEI work now is looked at as a marketing ploy versus the real work that gets to address the systems of oppression that we're trying to dismantle.
It's so scary, like to your point, like because what I'm noticing is even, we were just talking offline. So like living corporate, really, like we've had partnerships with Pfizer and LiveRamp. Shout out LiveRamp. What's up, Cam? What's up? Blah blah blah. But the point is, like we've been out here working as like a an amplifier and a DEI marketing platform and a different ways to really help engage Black and brown folks, like both internally and externally. But it's interesting because like we've also had propositions from certain brands or companies that may want to do something, but they're not open to like the way that we talk about this work or the way that we talk about Black and brown experiences. And so to your point, like you said, marketing, just so it tipped my ear, because I do think there's avenues for DEI marketing, but like the ways that it happens so often is extremely co-opted. It's not authentic or honest to marginalized experience. And then on top of that, some of it outright is just, it seems to be like really like DEI. There's such a large segment of DEI to me that seems to be really camouflage to help really drive assimilation. Right. So it's complete. It's not even actually about dismantling a thing. It's about right. So sometimes folks, we leverage like certain like historical language that's meant for healing or for reformation, and we use it and we point it internally. So basically DEI becomes some coping mechanism for you to better bear the brunt of these capitalistic and patriarchal systems.
Oof, you just said a lot there. But I agree. And I think sometimes it gets really complex to discern that, right? And to really draw the line. I mean, I talk about how representation in and of itself is such a tricky subject for us to navigate. Because on the one hand, we celebrate different representation of marginalized communities in positions of power or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily translate to changing the pattern of oppression, right? We see sometimes people who look like us replicating the same levels of harm and types of oppression in different systems that they're a part of. And so how do we make sure that we are doing everything that we can to really be clear about when systemic change is happening and when it's not being done in a way that actually centers the most marginalized people for the long term and doing more than just putting different faces in places that we want to see power being held.
So much of this space, and I think I tweeted about it, but I've also seen other people talk about it too. It's like, I think I'm just growing increasingly disinterested with diversifying capitalism. Like, I don't know. Look, I don't live in corporate, so I'll say, like, I don't actually care about like, the sole black or brown person being up there just for representation's sake, because if I engage them and I understand their ethics and their praxis, like they're not actually trying to do anything that would move the needle or push the ball forward or whatever euphemism you want to use when it comes to actually driving, creating liberation or dismantling harmful systems. Like I have so many conversations, you talk to folks and it's like, everyone's just trying to get to the top of the hill. They're not actually trying to like knock the hill down or level anything. They just want to be on top. And I guess like as I think about that and like this work in this space, like I'm curious, like you talked, like last time you were on, we talked about like even the term people of color and BIPOC and all those different things. And I recall you gave some fairly thoughtful answers as it pertains to, East Asian representation in the people of color framework. Like, I'd love to like kind of hear you expand more upon that in terms of like, one, the term itself, and then two, like, where East Asian identity kind of comes into play. I think it's really complex. I don't believe that I have the range to engage it thoughtfully. And so I'd love just to hear you talk more about it. And then I might ask a couple follow-up questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, before we get there, I think something that you just said around, diversifying capitalism and not being interested in having, people climbing the hill for the sole purpose of just individual success. And I think also the disappointment that comes from people who are part of marginalized identities not doing more than just representing and being the token, and not doing more to actually dismantle the systems. And I think it's such a common sense of disappointment that I hear from so many people, and I've struggled with myself when I've worked with people in positions of power who, occupy different marginalized identities, and yet they are not only upholders of systems of oppression, but they are, active participants in it, in continuing it. And I think the tricky part and the complexity comes in when we start to check ourselves with the kind of pressure that we put on the marginalized people to do more than just do their job and to exist, that we wouldn't expect from white people. Right. And so when we start to be like, I have to check my own disappointment in me wanting more from people of color and women and, differently marginalized people in positions of power, and just appreciating, like, when we get to a place where we can just appreciate people doing and living and existing in their own right without having to shoulder disproportionate amount of burden to do more to dismantle systems of oppression. I think that is the type of place that I would like for us to get to, that we're not there yet. Because I think oftentimes a critique gets so harsh and rushed when it comes to people of color in positions of power who did not sign up for DEI positions, right?
Right. True. Fair.
And I think there is ample amount of critique that we can have around internalized oppression of folks in different positions of power and how they're wielding the power, right? So I think what I'm wanting is sort of not the disproportionate amount of burden being placed on marginalized people in positions where they are, not being. Yeah.
No, that's fair. That's tough. Like it's tough. It's frustrating to hear, but you're not wrong in that. Like, and I think the other piece is that, like, we're all being subject to this exploitative system.
That's right.
Right. That's really built on scarcity, a scarcity mindset. It's built on, of course, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy. It's built on harm, and so we're all really kind of doing the best we can to survive in the ways that we can. And so, I temper my critique with like some level of like, I would say hopefully empathy, because like we do, like, I don't want to shame anybody for how they survive, as long as they're not surviving at the expense of my humanity. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think like that's where, when I think about some of this work, and then even when you think about like just just work. It's like it's so harsh. Like it's so much, like when I think about consulting, like thank God I'm not a consultant. It's like corporate America on like times 1,000. Like it's very much, it's like your typical, but it's like everything sped up to like 40, 50. Everything is just very harsh and fast. It's about you working 20 hours. It's about about you working 12 hours back to back, or taking on 3 or 4 different projects. And so when I think about like the labor and the physical toll it takes on you, and I think about people who are in these positions of authority, it's like, dang, I'm not asking you to be Kwame Ture. I am asking if you could just like not shit on me so bad. Like, can you see I'm getting jacked up over here? Can you just say something? Can you help? Can you think about somebody other than yourself? But I also do hear your point around the fact that like everyone does not sign up to be that. I would hope, my dream would be, and again, this is part of part of our American culture is it's so highly individualistic. Like we champion individualism. We don't just culturally, we don't really celebrate or engage community. We don't even think collaboratively, right? Let alone communally, right? So like, I hear you. It's tough.
I know. Yeah. And it's not that we should be, we should absolve people in positions of power for exploiting and causing harm onto marginalized people if they hold marginalized identities. That's not, I think, the point at all. It's that let's be really critical about how we are holding all leaders in positions of power accountable, right?
Yeah.
Versus disproportionately aiming at marginalized people and putting additional burden of labor on them, when we are not doing that same thing for white leaders and other leaders.
That's a fact
privilege.
too.
Yeah,
that's a fact too. Because I'm definitely, and I'll say this too, as someone who like I'm very, people who work with me now and who've worked with me in the past will tell you I am candid to a fault. Now definitely hit y'all both. Like, nah, you Bob over there is acting up, and you could do better too, right? So I hear your point. I asked you a bunch of different questions, but I do want to talk. I do want to talk about like like the dynamic of like particularly like East Asian represent. And I recognize, Michelle, you only one person. You can only speak for like 1/5 of all Asian people, so I'm not asking you. You know what I'm saying? but I would love this to hear your perspective, right? Because like there's so many different things happening simultaneously. So I'd love just to kind of hear you talk a little bit about that East Asian identity in the DEI space and the dynamics therein.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the Asian identity in general is something that is so complex and nuanced, and yet we often get so little visibility in this work. And I think there's still so much to be talked about and understood around the diaspora and the AAPI as a community as a whole. And to your point, I talk a lot about the need for us to start disaggregating the data and understanding the specific terminology, right? So let's not talk about East Asian issues only when we are celebrating AAPI Heritage Month, right? And within the Asian American umbrella, there are so many different ethnicities. There's East Asian identity, Southeast Asians. So there's so many different identities and stories that get flattened, and we become a monolith so easily in the eyes of DEI folks doing this work without paying attention to those details. And in terms of understanding the East Asian experiences in the workplace, I mean, I can really only speak for my own experience and my journey to understanding how and where I fit in the conversation around social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, because for so long and for so many people, the conversation has been black and white, and any sort of other identities that fall in between get lost in the shuffle. And I think that when the anti-Asian violence started really erupting, I was in conversation with many organizations that didn't even have a plan or strategy around, empowering their Asian employees. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of folks in how they're approaching their racial justice work, and why it is that Asians, and particularly East Asians, are so often categorized as a model minority, right? Who do not experience the types of oppression that other communities of color experience, because of this false myth that Asians are doing fine. They have it better than the rest. And I think there's also some portions of our community that have a lot of internalized oppression around that, and who have not been politicized, who have not felt the desire, the need, or the capacity to engage in these conversations, who are just starting to join the fold in demanding, more visibility and more action towards their empowerment.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, so I guess my couple follow-up questions are like, what does it look like to one, hold on, let me back up before I ask that question. You said something earlier about like DEI really just being very binary, black and white, right? Men, women, black, white,
Mm-hmm.
straight, gay, maybe sometimes. They don't really do that a lot, but sometimes.
Bi erasure is real. Biphobia is
right,
real. Yep.
right. And so, like, do you think like the lack of just like intersectional practice or analysis is it incompetence? Is it laziness? Is it both? Is it ignorance? It's hard for me. Look, it's 2022, right? So I'm, we shoot it straight over here. No pun intended.
That's true.
I am heterosexual. You know what I mean? Okay. So, but my point, we're keeping it honest. It's 2022. I feel like we know that like gay, like queer black people exist, that like that women who are also black or brown exist, that like disabled East Asians exist, like, but we're not there. We still aren't really communicating that, and our messaging isn't intersectional. So I'm curious, like, why do you think we're still not being intersectional in our engagement of this space and this work on popular in the mainstream?
Yeah, I think, well, a couple of things. I think there is definitely, ignorance. And I think it's important for us to kind of trace that ignorance back to how our systems manufacture very intentionally that ignorance in the masses, that we don't teach these things in school, right? When we think about the invisibility of Asian Americans in our history, we're not taught the vast majority of our historical facts and stories and our activism in school. We don't talk about it. So in part, I think it's a deliberate way of maintaining that ignorance as a society, which makes it a lot more difficult for us to move the needle on these conversations. Second reason why I think that sometimes we lack the intersectional analysis is because still, I think so many folks think of these issues as being siloed and separate. I hear this very often when I was, in the midst of all the anti-Asian violence that was happening. I started posting about challenging anti-Black racism as a part of that work, and also the importance of moving in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And the messages that I received included disappointment and hurt and worries about, are we yet again putting aside our issues to show up for other communities? What about us? How could you show up for these communities at a time when, all of us are in so much suffering? And that broke my heart, in part because, one, there was so much trauma in my community that was being processed without a lot of guidance. And two, because that showed me how our community was still talking about and thinking about our issue as being separate from anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter movement. So the important thing is for me to then connect the dots and tell my folks that I'm not showing up for the Black Lives Matter march because I have Black friends. I'm showing up also because I know the forces that are oppressing you is oppressing my people. So when I show up for Black people, it's not just because I care about Black people as friends and, as a good person. It's also because I know that our liberation is tied together. Because I know if I dismantle white supremacy that's oppressing Black folks, then I'm also fighting for my people at the same time. But I don't think people are drawing those connections. And I don't think people think about, within the Asian community, there are Black people, there are Black Asians. There, within the Asian community, there are queer people. So if we're not intersectional, we're also not serving our community, because there are queer trans people in our community. There are undocumented people in our community. There are imprisoned people, incarcerated people in our community, right? So the more people can tie these loose ends and really connect the dots to see that all of our issues, all of our struggles are so inextricably tied and connected to one another's, that there is really, as Audre Lorde said, there is no single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. So I think that's really at the crux of it.
It's always refreshing to talk to you. As I think about like the next phase of this journey, I can't help but think about Gen Z. They're continuing to come into the workforce. They're my siblings. They're my cousins. I don't know if organizations are prepared. They're hardly prepared to deal with millennials. So
exactly.
I know that
they never were. Yeah, and I don't know. I don't think they are.
Like, am I wrong? I mean, it seems as if they're going to be like the most like diverse, probably politically aware and engaged, technologically savvy, if not necessarily technically savvy, but understanding technology group that's ever really come into the workforce en masse. I mean, what thoughts or what thoughts do you have about executive leaders as they get ready to receive this new class of workers?
My advice to people in positions of power, especially executive leaders, have always been get out of their way. Get out of the way and cede some power, right? I think that's some of the most difficult conversations that I had with leaders is talking about what they're willing to give up to do the work that they say they are committed to doing. I'm not putting words into people's mouths. I am not in the business of trying to change people's minds. I'm not in the business of trying to get people who don't care to care, right? My job is to hold up the mirror and show people when they're out of integrity with what they're saying. My job is to show people that, hey, you said you have commitments around these things and you have these values. And in order for you to be in alignment with those values, this is the conversation we need to have. And part of that is understanding what they need to give up, what they're willing to forgo, whether it's time, resources, power, reputation, what have you. But that's been the toughest conversation with leaders, because I don't think most people calculate the amount of work or the trade-offs that they are needing to make in order to create equity, because the status quo is imbalanced, right? The power is not in the hands of the most marginalized people. So in order for us to create that change, we need to give up some resources and power. So for the Gen Z coming in, I feel that there are so many ways in which that we can center the most marginalized people, not just in Gen Z generation, but all generations. And, I feel like the education spreads faster because of social media these days. And the conversations can advance quickly because of the information that's out there, which I think is a great thing. And if Gen Z, and I don't hold the, I don't hold on to the belief that younger generation by default are more progressive. Because as we've seen from studies, the millennial generation is actually just as racist as their predecessors. Because, if we're not doing that work intergenerationally, then the outcome's still going to be the same. So my hope is that as we welcome new generations, we also open up the possibilities for younger people having that voice, that power to be able to create change, and not to break them down so quickly in a way that only seeds resentment and cynicism in doing this work, because that's what I see over and over again when young, people who believe in the possibility of change join these companies, and they are met with challenge after challenge and the gaslighting after gaslighting. It is so hard to hold on to that hope that change is possible, right? It's so hard. It's so easy to be cynical and jaded about the kinds of change that you can see inside workplaces, especially in corporate America, especially in tech. And what I really want our young people to feel is that sense of encouragement, the sense of community, the sense of intergenerational support and solidarity, so that they can hold on to that hope and not be written off as being idealist who doesn't know anything, and have their hope be written off as naivete, because that's so often what this world does to us. So I just want to encourage our young people to hold on to that hope and be that idealist, be called naive, because I believe that change is possible if we can all be willing to move forward together.
Come on, Michelle. So, it's interesting. I got a couple more things because recently I said something and you responded and said the lack of quality control in this space is ridiculous. Talk about what you mean when you say lack of quality control.
Oh, so specifically in the DEI space, I think we've observed as a discipline a lot of newcomers who are excited about this work, which I think in and of itself is a good thing. I think since the 2020, the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I really energized people from all walks of life to want to join in this movement towards social justice. And I also see that enthusiasm and desire to do something being carried out without the intentionality and the thoughtfulness on multiple parties' part. So a lot of people are entering this work without the necessary foundation and grounding of what it is that they're really fighting for. And I think a lot of companies are taking that also opportunity to be very performative in their work and are quick to hire people without vetting what it is that they're trying to achieve, or without really thinking through their why and without really thinking through their overall goal. So with the growing number of people who are doing DEI work as their profession without a lot of training, without a lot of grounding or values that are being guided by social justice, mixed with very sort of opportunistic companies that are quick to throw money at people to just check off a list of to-dos and say that they've done something without having changed anything in a fundamental way, that mix become really disorienting in order for us to actually create sustainable and meaningful change that's aligned to the values of the movement as a whole. So that's what I mean by lack of quality control. People don't know how to vet people. I think that's also a big problem, is that people who are hiring consultants, people who are hiring DEI people internally, don't have a good sense of how to evaluate people's competencies, right? And this is, I've heard some horror stories about how DEI trainings have gone, very, very wrong because the facilitator simply did not have the competency to hold such nuanced, complex conversations that end up creating a lot of ripple effects of harm that's difficult to undo. And that ends up causing a lot of, jadedness and cynicism on the part of marginalized employees who are watching this just burn.
It's because, it's interesting. I see this like trend, and I think I was talking to who, I don't know, I was talking to Dr. Session. I don't know, I was talking to somebody. It just gives me scammer vibes. Like when I see content, and I like give you an example, that Home Depot scandal, right? People got mad about the Home Depot content. I looked at it and I was like, okay, yeah, I see why y'all are mad. Like, and like unpopular opinion, Michelle, I don't actually think that type of training is beneficial. Like in a workplace, I don't think that matters. Like I think you can easily Google those things. You can make a PowerPoint slide and you turn it vertical and you print it out and you have training, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, what are we talking about? Why do I care about police brutality when I'm working at Home Depot? I need to organize these screwdrivers and put these nails up I need to clock in and clock out on time. Like, it's just easy to just go intersectionality, police brutality, misogyny, racism, and then like put them in a blender and then throw up on a piece of paper and then ask people to sign something and then maybe make some commitments and then you leave and you've netted $20,000 in like 30 minutes. And it's like, if not more, because I hear the numbers. I know what folks charging out here. All right. So, but my point is, it's so much like one like it's that type of work. Like I'm not saying that like knowing about those things are not valuable, because they do have value. They don't have immediate impact and value in like a 9-to-5 job. That like, unless like, now if you're an academic or you're, I don't know, but like so much more what I would appreciate is someone doing a true organizational assessment of an institution, reviewing their policies, their practices, their procedures, looking at their org layout, their representation, maybe doing some sentiment analysis and like pairing that to see, okay, here's how people feel. Here's how people feel. Here are the demographics of those feelings. We know that Gen X Black women in this department feel like this compared to white women like this. Here's how much you're getting paid, blah, blah, blah. So a true blue org assessment, and then take the grassroots movements and historical liberation exercises and activities and philosophies that we have in America, and then apply all that to then fixing the problems of the actual organization. Now, see what I just said, a bunch of people going to hear that and be like, that sounds super complex, Phil. You just threw a bunch of words together. But that's actually the work. In my perspective, that's the work. It's like, no, it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis. It's a combination and leadership, coaching and development, change management, coaching and policy, like over several quarters, right? Like, so like what I just described is probably like a 2-year exercise. The analysis alone is going to take you like 4 to 6 weeks, right? The readout, like, so it's tough for me when I see like content, and it's almost like, and again, like, I talk to my therapist about this all the time, like, and my mentor also, I presume people are way smarter than they are. So let me tell you what I think is going on. I think these organizations know this training is some bullshit. And what they're doing is they're saying, look, we can just check the box. We can say we spent $50,000 and we don't actually have to do anything. Right now, I feel like the Michelle Kims of the world, and the more gentle and probably more empathetic and patient people would say, I don't think that they always know that. I'm sure you would probably say something different. Like, am I being too harsh in my assessment?
No, I don't think you're being too harsh, because I do think that there are companies who are deliberately taking that approach, because training is, I think, probably the lowest hanging fruit in most people's minds in terms of signaling that they're doing something rather than doing nothing. So I think the problem that I see is exactly what you're saying, in terms of people thinking that training in and of itself is going to cause some type of dramatic transformation inside the organization without any of those other parts that you just talked about. I think training and education serve a very specific purpose in helping people be educated about a very particular topic that they have chosen to explore during that training session, right? So I don't discount the importance of education and training. I think it's important. But I think also there are so many types of trainings that are out there that are not effective, that are also causing harm, and that are just being used as a checkbox exercise. When we talk about, for example, what you were talking about in terms of talking about police brutality, why is that relevant to the workplace? Why is that relevant to the Home Depot employees or any tech employees for that matter? I think there is a very real connection that we can draw that most people won't draw when we're talking about these issues, again, in silos, where, policing of Black people happen in the workplace too. It looks different, right?
Yes.
So how do we make those connections, right? Like, so let's take something that is hyper visible right now and very relevant to our society as a whole, but let's make this really, really focused to the employees so that they can learn how their behavior is contributing to the same cycles of oppression of Black people in the workplace today, right? That to me is a worthwhile conversation. And how do we then take that learning and apply that to our performance review criteria? How do we take this to then, our hiring policies? How do we take this to changing our benefits policy? So that's the holistic picture of how the work should be happening, not just, let's do a very bland blanket 1 hour lunch and learn conversation around unconscious bias. And let's call that done, right? That is not
Listen,
the entire project.
I said this before, and it got a couple of blowback, but I didn't get enough heat for it, so I'm gonna say it again. I said this a couple years ago. I really think white folks, they made, like, the same lab that they made crack in the 80s, they made unconscious bias. That's not it's a real thing. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's real. It's real.
Yeah.
But a lot of this bias is not unconscious. It'd be mad conscious, Michelle. Michelle, like, this anti-Asian violence, this is conscious. You know what I'm saying? Like, come on now. Like, that is so annoying. Like, I haven't actually seen anybody say unconscious bias. I haven't seen that, like, in my work lately. But I swear, the next time I see somebody saying unconscious bias, I'm gonna flip the tables over like Jesus in the tabernacle, and I'm gonna whip somebody, because, like, it's insane.
Unconscious bias is real, right?
It's real. It's real.
And
It's
I
real.
think how people are using the concept of unconscious bias as some sort of a silver bullet to all systems of oppression, I think that is such a huge problem, and how people are exploiting that to, provide very short-term solutions, or not even solutions, but just the facade of progress for having done one unconscious bias training. I think that is such an issue that we do need to address.
So the reason why, and look, unconscious bias clearly is triggering to me, but I'll tell you, I'll give you a story as to why. So, the summer or so before George Floyd was murdered, I was on a project in consulting, and I was the only black man and the only man on my team. Everybody else was a bunch of white women. Okay. And was treated wildly disrespectfully, right? Bunch of betrayals, microaggressions, macroaggressions, otherization, but any word, a bunch of words you want to use, Michelle, they apply.
Yeah.
And someone hit me up after George Floyd was murdered, and they said, yo, like, I saw this dead body on camera, made me think of you. I want to text you, see how you're doing. And I was like, but check this out. The person who hit me with that was the same woman who was my manager and who had harmed me several times over, right? And I named that when I responded, because I took about a day, because I was like, am I going to respond? I'm going to pray about it. When black people say, by the way, when black folks say they're going to pray about it, they're not really praying about it. It's just a phrase. It's really a turn of phrase. Some black people pray, but most of us, we don't really praying like that. Anyway, point is, I did actually pray about it, though. And I responded, and her response was like, yeah, it must be my unconscious bias. And I was like, nah, dog. It wasn't unconscious bias. You threw me under the bus several times. You lied on me. And then you said no, it wasn't unconscious. You made a bunch of conscious steps and decisions. So anyway, like, we could talk all day. Like, let's talk, before we let you go, let's talk about your latest book. Okay. I personally, I personally am always excited to hear your words, and the fact that, like, you're able to, I don't know, you the way that you present context around issues of the day, and you speak to them very thoughtfully. I was really excited to check out the way. Now, look, you didn't send me a free copy of the Wake Up. I don't know what's going on. I get it. I'm not in the elite verified Twitter circles that you rub shoulders in, and it's fine. I didn't know I didn't get a no, I did not get a box. And we do giveaways over here, so maybe we could. I don't know, but
we'll make it happen.
Not.
Don't worry.
All right, cool. Now, but let's talk a little bit about the Wake Up. First of all, why did you call it the Wake Up?
The Wake Up as a title, it was a tough decision, because I feel like the title of the book is so important. One, it's related to the work that I've been doing with Awaken, so there's a little bit of play on word. But really, the Wake Up for me was signaling how people often wake up to the problems of social injustice in the world in an ongoing manner, and how we're always waking up to different issues and different inequities, different struggles and challenges of different marginalized communities. But really, the wake up that I also wanted to underscore in the book is how we are then waking up to ourselves. our own capacity to transform, our own capacity to hold ourselves accountable, and to wake up to the fullest extent of our humanity for us to be able to do this work. So when I talk about the wake up, it's twofold. It's waking up to the external world, but more importantly, how that then inspires us to wake up to ourselves and what we are capable of.
You said something there just now about holding ourselves accountable. What is, I think it's especially, again, like we keep talking about like this, these systems that we live in and that we engage, we operate in. I think accountability
Mm-hmm.
is so often tied to punishment or pain. And I also believe, and I'm not a psychologist. Shout out to the break room though. But I'm not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. That we sometimes can veer away from one, holding other people accountable or holding ourselves accountable because of our aversion to discomfort and frankly like our addiction to comfort. Like, what would you say accountability really looks like, not only for another person, but to what you just spoke to about with your book, The Wake Up, accountability for yourself?
Yeah. You're so right that there is so much shame around accountability and admitting that you may have caused harm. And part of the waking up is waking up to our own complicity in systems of oppression by the nature of our existence, because we exist in a capitalist, white supremacist, misogynist world. So if we're not really conscious about and intentional about waking up to how we are perpetuating those systems of oppression, we're going to be complicit in oppressing other people, whether we like it or not. And I think that's a really difficult thing for people to admit because we are living in a culture of punishment. And we know what happens to people who have caused harm or who are seen as racist, sexist, what have you. We exile them, we excommunicate, we punish them, we shame them. And that is also the teachings of white supremacy culture. The way that we incarcerate people, the way that we criminalize people, we pathologize different marginalized communities historically. All those behaviors are learned and taught, and we enforce them systemically and institutionally. And so one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from studying from and learning from abolitionists and people who are doing incredibly radical work of transforming the justice system or the legal system, and trying to abolish the prison system is this notion of how do we abolish not just the cops on the street, but the cops in our heads? And how do we make sure that we are instilling in ourselves the values of redemption, transformation, and healing and forgiveness, not for the sake of other people, but for our own humanity, and for us to be able to reclaim the narrative that change is possible? I think that, coupled with envisioning better futures, envisioning futures where all of us can be free and healed and be in collective joy and liberation, I think that is such a powerful vision for us to work towards, in which we then become more gentle, more compassionate with ourselves when we make mistakes, and we allow for us to exist in the gray zone. So it's not that we need to absolve each other of harm that we've caused, but that before we even hold other people accountable, how do we practice us being okay with not being a good person or a bad person, racist or not a racist? How do we tread the middle ground where we're just people, we're just human beings doing things that can have bad or harmful or beneficial outcomes for marginalized people that we're trying to be in solidarity with? How do we actually get out of that binary thinking and allow ourselves to exist as a multidimensional human being that is capable of doing good, but that's also capable of doing harm? So how do we make sure that we stay the course and make sure we're holding ourselves accountable to the values that we hold dear to our hearts without anyone having to call us out? Because we're doing that first for ourselves, for the benefit of not just other people, but for our own humanity. And I think in order for us to do that, we got to stop thinking in this binary way, right? Just because somebody said you're a good ally doesn't mean that you get to keep that label for the rest of your life, right? Just because somebody has is identified as a good person or self-identifies as a good person, that doesn't mean that their actions are going to have good outcomes. So the only thing we can control is us being human and being accountable to our own actions and impacts, and being allowed that room to learn and transform, and not running away because of the fear of shame.
Goodness gracious, Michelle, I want to thank you so much. I'm gonna just say this, I'm gonna put it out because I know people say, like, what's it, speak it in the universe and all that kind of stuff. So I'm gonna say this: there's no reason that, Michelle, that we shouldn't be trying to figure out some way to collaborate together. I'm serious. Like, I love everything that you're about. I'm so happy that you're able to be a guest again on Living Corporate, and I'm just honored to know you, honored to engage in your work, and I'm excited about us like continuing to talk both on Living Corporate, off Living Corporate, on other platforms, continuing to amplify what you're doing. Thank you so much for being a guest, and I look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, and I'm honored to be a part of this.
Awesome. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Peace. And we're back. Yo, make sure you check out The Wake Up. Shout out to Michelle Kim. Shout out to the whole Living Corporate team. I'm thankful for everything that y'all are doing. If you haven't already followed, I've been saying this every couple of weeks now. Make sure you're following us, that you're subscribed. We got some new. I don't know how else to say it. New fire for your head top. It's coming soon. You don't want to be on the outside looking in. All right. So make sure you're following us everywhere that you can follow us. We're on all the socials. Make sure you give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, y'all, this has been Zach with Living Corporate. Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.